This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're at a military training camp in Poland after Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced plans to double the size of the army, but not everyone's keen to enlist. We cross the alligator-infested waters of the Rio Grande River on the US-Mexico border to hear what locals think of Donald Trump's immigration crackdown. And 80 years on from Nazi Germany's surrender in the Second World War, we tell the story of the babies born in Bergen-Belsen. But first, it's not yet 6 months since the Assad regime fell in Syria, but the new transitional government is facing tough challenges. Perhaps greatest among them is unifying a country made up of numerous fighting factions, and winning the trust of the country's religious minorities is proving particularly tricky. It's a problem that's been compounded by a wave of sectarian violence, including attacks back in March against Alawite villages along Syria's coast. Hundreds of people were killed. Lucy Williamson recently embedded with the country's newly formed security forces, travelling into hard-to-reach communities that came under attack, and saw the country's schisms up close.
At the immigration desk at Syria's newly opened Damascus airport, I had questions. I'd just seen a group of Tajik visitors pay $25 for their Syrian visas. The same entry visa for my American cameraman had cost $200. But the immigration officer instead wanted to talk about King Arthur. The myth of the medieval British king had captured his imagination. Who was he really? He asked me, his face alight with admiration, and then insistently, did he actually exist? Syria's belief in heroes has been sorely tested, but the story of a valiant British king who brought warriors together around the governing round table had stuck with this friendly Syrian bureaucrat as his own divided country navigates a new dawn. 5 months ago, a former jihadist fighter swept to power here, promising to unite the country. Since then, the question of identity, of who people really are and how far to trust it, has haunted Syria. And nowhere is that question felt more keenly than along Syria's short stretch of Mediterranean coast, a former stronghold of the Assad regime. In early March, fighters loyal to Syria's deposed president led deadly raids on government security forces there. The new Sunni Islamist-led government called on armed factions for support, but that open invitation escalated into a wave of sectarian violence aimed at civilians from the country's Alawite minority, the Shia Muslim sect to which former President Assad himself belongs. Human rights groups estimate that almost 900 civilians were killed. Among them, 3 brothers of Hanadi Zahlut, an Alawite activist who opposed the Assad regime. They forced civilians to crawl on the ground, to bark like animals before killing them, she told me. No distinction was made between supporters of the ex-regime and innocent people. Some were even part of the opposition to Assad. Syria's coastal region has now been largely sealed off, and access is tightly controlled. In our 90-minute drive up the coastal highway, we passed more than a dozen checkpoints, manned by a range of Syrian security forces. A show of strength by the government, the heavy controls designed to deter another insurgent attack. But mistrust of these new security forces has also left Alawite civilians kettled into their villages by fear. You could disappear at a checkpoint any time, just because you're an Alawite, one young woman told me. It's the rule of the jungle. In the village of Snowbar, residents told us they were afraid to pass the checkpoint that has sprung up at the village entrance, or risk the frequent checks along the road to the nearby cities of Latakia and Tartus. Security forces regularly asked if they were Alawite or Sunni, they said, and would check their ID cards. Stories of Alawite civilians killed or kidnapped in the region spiraled daily across social media, adding to the fears. In Snowbar, where activists say some 200 people were killed during the violence in March, terrified residents said that some of the units involved in the killings were still manning checkpoints or moving in and out of Snowbar at will. We accept everything that happened, one villager told me. We just want quiet. Looking for justice now will bring more problems. A small, wiry man with an easy smile, he spoke in urgent whispers as we passed his workplace, afraid to be seen talking to us openly. Syria's new transitional president, Ahmed al-Shara, has vowed to protect minorities and unite the country. But Syria's sectarian divisions are deep, inflamed by years of civil war, and Mr. al-Shara, who once led the Syrian affiliate of al-Qaeda, faces a mammoth task to build trust. After all, until 5 months ago, many in the new security forces were rebel fighters with different opposition groups. Some army brigades are still being paid by Turkey, others are manned by Islamist fighters from Mr. al-Shara's own Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Most of the all-male units we spent time with seemed relaxed having a woman alongside them on patrol. Others preferred not to make eye contact when speaking to me. Many Alawites wonder if old attitudes and resentments still lurk behind the shiny new uniforms. Add to that, recruitment to the police and general security forces has been rapid, with minimal training. The level of discipline varies. Trust is now the most valuable commodity in Syria, and the hardest to mine. In the coastal region of Latakia, that task has been largely handed to the region's general security forces. We went with them on a trust-building exercise to collect weapons from Alawite villagers, part of an amnesty program launched after the insurgent attacks. We threaded through the countryside in a convoy of trucks bristling with armed men, their weapons brushing the hedgerows as we passed, watched silently by residents from balconies and porches. These country lanes were the veins through which Syria's bloodlust surged in March. The reception we got was wary. A crowd of older men greeted us coolly on arrival and took us into a building where a small collection of guns had been carefully laid out on the floor. A dozen old Kalashnikovs, one completely encased in rust. An officer banged the guns against the wall to force the chamber open. "They're playing with us," one commander told me skeptically. More interesting and more valuable were the discussions that took place outside under the trees. Villagers standing in a circle around the commander, masked security forces fanned out around them, alert. The village elders complained about the men at the checkpoints and about someone on a motorbike firing weapons in the village at night. "If anything happens, let me know," the commander told them. "My guys will deal with them. And if you witness any armed men who don't work with us, let me know immediately and we'll come. You have my number." This was the real trust-building exercise. "Let's open a new chapter," he continued. "What's past is past. Let's start over so people can get back to their lives." After the killings in March, some in these villages see the general security units as a shield against other, more feared government forces and the extremist groups allied with them. But this is a delicate dance for both sides. Thousands of Assad loyalists from Syria's old army are thought to be still hiding in Alawite villages along this coast, preparing another attack. We heard later that a police patrol came under fire in the same area that day, with 2 officers killed. But launching a counter-offensive against former regime fighters now could shatter the uneasy calm here and trigger more sectarian attacks. Instead, one senior figure told me the priority was to reassure Alawite civilians and protect them from attack by other pro-government groups. And that, he said, meant not saying publicly what he knew to be true, that the line between civilians and insurgents was not always as black and white as he had to pretend, and that, in some cases, villagers had supported attacks on government forces. Dangerous information to publicise when hundreds of civilians, including women and children, were executed in their homes under exactly that pretext. But this is a complicated situation. We were taken to meet two men, now in custody, for taking part in the ambush in March. One, an officer in Assad's old army, didn't want to speak to us, but the other man did, a grocer from a village in Ain al-Baida, who described how he and several neighbours joined a band of insurgents to target government vehicles on the highway. They didn't give us an opportunity to say yes or no, he told me. They had evil in their eyes. They asked for my ID to check if I'm Alawite, and they also asked if there were any Sunnis around. During the ambush, he said, he and many others fired at a car of security forces, sending it crashing into the central reservation, before some of the attackers headed towards it. The people inside were still alive, he told me. We could hear their voices. But then they killed them. They executed them all. I still feel guilty, he said. I'd never carry a weapon again, even if it cost me my neck. Working out who's who in the new Syria and who to trust is a fraught and complicated task. The man at the top, Transitional President Ahmed al-Shara, has made an effort himself to shift his image from a stern Islamist extremist to an inclusive and flexible leader, willing to talk to all parties and make deep concessions for peace. But many of the country's minorities, not just Alawites but also Christians, Kurds and Druze, distrust his transformation, while many of Mr. al-Shara's own hardline allies disapprove of it. Syria is, for now, held together by his promises, but the path between them is paper-thin, and pressure from all sides is growing. As I left, after weeks of speaking to people on the coast, I wondered again about the immigration officer I met and his love of the King Arthur legend. Legends can seem simple, but Syria today is anything but. And the danger is that in the face of this new complicated reality, Syria's diverse communities will simply cling harder to their own familiar myths.
Lucy Williamson. Recent rhetoric from the Trump administration and Washington's diplomatic overtures to the Kremlin have made many Eastern European countries nervous. There are increasing concerns about the USA's commitment to NATO and the threat its absence would pose to the security of countries like Poland. In March, Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced Poland would spend almost 5% of its GDP on defence this year, the highest in NATO, while introducing new plans for the large-scale military training of civilians. Will Vernon recently visited one of the army training camps.
As the battered Soviet-era troop carrier lumbers down the riverbank and splashes into the water, the rat-tat-tat of automatic gunfire can be heard nearby. The men and women clinging to the top of the vehicle next to me don't flinch, though. They don't duck for cover, because they're here to learn how to survive a scenario that would have seemed unimaginable in post-Cold War Poland, an armed attack against the country. I've joined a Saturday morning training course for Polish civilians run by the military. They're shown how to shoot a rifle, build a shelter, and tend to casualties. But the real war isn't too far from here. The Ukrainian border is about a 4-hour drive away. The times are dangerous now, explains Adam Szelicki, a rosy-cheeked Polish army captain in charge here. We need to be ready. We have a threat from the east, from Russia. This course is now being expanded, following a government announcement in March, part of Poland's lightning military build-up. Warsaw has been on a spending spree, acquiring missile systems, tanks and aircraft. And the plans have been accelerated since Donald Trump returned to the White House. His lukewarm commitment to NATO and European security has caused alarm here. Ever since he became president, we've been more worried because he doesn't really care about Europe and the situation here, says Agata, one of the volunteers on the course with a shock of blonde hair and a beaming smile. She slips on a trendy pair of sunglasses after removing her gas mask. If we're not prepared and Russia attacks us, we'll become their prisoners. Taking a break from hand-to-hand combat lessons, Dariusz tells me history has taught Poles a tough lesson. That we must be prepared to defend ourselves on our own, he sighs. We cannot rely on anyone else. Reminders of that history of Russian occupation can be felt everywhere in Poland. In a state-run care home, I meet a woman who remembers the last time Russian forces invaded. Wanda Traciek-Stawska was 12 years old in September 1939, when Poland was occupied first by Nazi Germany and then by the Soviet Union. We knew Russia had attacked us. We were exposed after the Germans invaded, says Wanda. My father was very worried. She shows me a picture of herself later in the war, brandishing a gun as a young fighter during the Warsaw Uprising, when the Polish resistance fought the Nazi occupiers in the ruins of the capital. As we discuss more recent events, the war in Ukraine and Poland's newfound military prowess, her eyes glint with a fire that clearly hasn't been extinguished 80 years after the last war ended. Speaking as a soldier, I know that weapons are the most important thing, Wanda says, especially for countries that border Russia. I really regret being old, otherwise I would go and help the Ukrainians. She flashes me a smile. You know, I was a good fighter. Some Poles are taking measures to prepare for a future war. Janusz Janczy, the head of a company that builds bomb shelters in people's houses, shows me around a demonstration bunker, which he's mocked up in a warehouse. None of his customers would agree to let me into a real one, he explains, as they don't want their neighbors to know they have a bunker. Janusz says he's been inundated with inquiries since Donald Trump's return to power. My clients are concerned that NATO wouldn't come to defend Poland, he says. They're afraid of Russia, and they're building these shelters simply because they don't know what to expect tomorrow. In the nearby university city of Wrocław, the sun is beginning to set on a Friday evening. Students are drinking wine on the banks of the Oder River. I ask some of them whether they would defend Poland in the event of war. The war is very close but feels quite far away, says medical student Marcel, before adding, if Russia attacked, I think I'd run. I just don't really see anything worth dying for here, says another. I'd be the first one to escape the country. That same day, one of the main national newspapers publishes a survey saying only around 11% of Poles would enlist in the army in the event of war. It seems the young people of Poland might yet take a bit of convincing before they're ready to join up.
Will Vernon.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
The invasion of our country is over, Donald Trump declared triumphantly in a post on his Truth Social platform at the beginning of March. He was referring to the plummeting number of illegal border crossings being made after enforcing a sweeping immigration crackdown. President Trump's trenchant message has proven an effective deterrent. His recent sanctioning of deportations without due process has struck fear into both resident and undocumented migrants, as Nomia Iqbal discovered in Texas.
What first strikes you when you arrive at the Rio Grande, the river that flows along the US-Mexico border, is how vast and calm it is. But the riverbanks are eerie. Glance at the ground and baking in the hot sun are discarded belongings, underwear hanging in a tree, flip-flops buried in the mud, half-empty water bottles, a large carrier bag tangled in the fence, and a bright yellow wire cutter. Someone tried to use it to break through the miles and miles of menacing razor fence. The US Border Patrol agent I'm travelling with, Mickey Donaldson, shows me holes where people managed to get through. As we speed across the river by boat, I can see a father and son are fishing from the riverbank on the Mexican side. We all wave, but the border agents start muttering to each other. They can never be too sure, they say. The father and son could be carrying out a reconnaissance with a view to crossing over. This is essentially the front line in President Trump's war against illegal immigration. I say war because that's how he sees it. He has invoked an old wartime power to deport Venezuelan immigrants to El Salvador with little due process. Judges have blocked it for now. Back in 2023, when Joe Biden was president, US Border Patrol recorded nearly 9,000 arrests in a single day here on the southern border. He implemented tougher restrictions, which brought numbers down, but public anger remained, and it gave President Trump something potent to campaign on. Since Donald Trump's inauguration, border arrests have dropped dramatically further and are now the lowest they've been since tracking began 25 years ago. Border agents put it down to what they describe as consequences. People crossing over face prosecution in a way they didn't before, and the Trump administration also ended a program that allowed migrants to book asylum appointments while waiting at the border. That's been scrapped, so people are turned away even if they approach legal ports of entry. Agent Donaldson is tall, wearing sunglasses and with a gun on his hip. He is imposing, but easy to talk to. He tells me he and his team feel more empowered to do their jobs now. Before, we were doing a lot of humanitarian work, he says, before adding, anybody that's struggling, of course, we are going to help. He tells me about the time they helped a pregnant woman from El Salvador who nearly drowned. He says he was used to seeing a drowning every day last year. He tells me that his team does care about immigrants, though the agents often slip into official speak and use the word adversary to describe them. We spot an alligator splashing about in the river as we climb back onto the boat. The agents have nicknamed him Gary the Gator. You'd think that alone would put many off from crossing, but the agents say it really doesn't. We say our goodbyes and I head to the Texan town of Eagle Pass. It's a curious place with a split identity. Most of the 30,000 residents here are of Latino or Mexican descent. People know this place has always been a flashpoint when it comes to immigration, but now there's a sense of fear in the air. I'm scared. I'm at risk, says Alex, who works in the local market. He's from Mexico and a legal US resident, but feels one mistake, as he describes it, could see him deported. He's seen the controversial case of Kilma Abrego Garcia, who was also living legally in the US and was deported to a notorious prison in El Salvador without due process. What intrigues me the most, however, is that Texas has a huge Latino population, and more than half of them voted for Donald Trump. During his campaign, he pitched two things to them: making the economy better and cracking down on immigration. The latter cut through, as many Latinos do separate themselves from recent immigrants. But now that the reality of Mr. Trump's hardline immigration policies has hit, the mood has changed. One poll suggests more than 60% of Latinos think President Trump has gone too far, with nearly half saying they're worried someone close to them could be deported. At a local supermarket in San Antonio, one woman says he's doing what he promised, and I'm scared. Others still back the president, but there's a schism. One man, Jason, out walking his dog, stops when I ask him about the government's policies. I think dreamers, people who are undocumented, have lived and worked in the US for decades, should be given a path to citizenship, he says. Back at the border, the agents have a similar take. We want people to come here, says one agent who himself is Latino. Just legally, he says. But what legally means right now is up for debate.
Nomia Iqbal. And finally, this week marked the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe, or VE Day, when Nazi Germany surrendered in the Second World War. In April and May of 1945, many Nazi concentration camps were liberated, including Bergen-Belsen in Germany. It's estimated some 50,000 to 70,000 people were murdered there. and shortly after its liberation, a displaced persons camp was established nearby to house survivors, where many babies were born. Amy Leibowitz travelled to Bergen-Belsen to meet those returning to their birthplace 80 years on, and to see if she could find more information about her own family.
Passing through the streets of Celle, with their timber-framed houses, I saw plenty of graffiti. No Nazis, F racism, migrants welcome. Just a 30-minute drive up the road from this picturesque town is the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and nearby is the displaced persons camp, where Holocaust survivors were sent after Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British Armed Forces. I have a personal connection to this place. My great-grandmother's cousins, who were Polish, were imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen. My grandmother used to mention Minna, Leah, and Brenda in passing, but not say much more about them than they were in the camps and eventually made it to London because of Uncle Harry. I'd heard there'd be a gathering at the museum to mark their liberation, so I decided to just go on a whim to see if I could collect any stories, and a week later found myself in a restaurant, surrounded by elderly strangers and their family members, who all had one thing in common. They had all been born at Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. Surrounded by chatty Americans and Canadians, there was an instant connection. This Displaced Persons Camp, or DP camp, which housed the survivors, was built a few kilometres away from the concentration camp. 2,000 people were born there over 5 years before it closed in 1950. Sitting around me was Karen, Anita, Felicia, and Susan, proudly showing me their US and Canadian passports. They all said birthplace, Germany. Though it's complicated. They may have been born there, but in reality, born stateless. Known as the Bergen-Belsen babies, their parents were survivors who were housed in blocks there until another country would accept them, or a family member could coordinate with the Red Cross and repatriate them. Some told me how they'd been rejected by several countries, so they were forced to stay in the DP camp for years. Bergen-Belsen, despite all its associations, became their home. On the day of liberation, I heard about stories of couples who first met each other in a line or a group waiting to be registered, and a month later, they got married. I was told they all shared the one wedding dress. It didn't matter if it fitted or not. Within a year, babies were born. The women I spoke to were emphatic about one thing. This place isn't just about the tragedies that occurred. Life moved on, and their births were a symbol of that. I was struck by their resolutely positive attitude. One woman, Karen, told me how she'd stayed up all night talking about solving the world's problems with other Bergen-Belsen babies. Keen to find out more about my own family, I went to speak to the head archivist, Bernd Horstmann, who I'd been in email contact with. At the museum, he took me to a room full of books and binders from floor to ceiling. I sat across from him as he produced a pile of documents. There they were, Minna, Leah, and Brenda, my grandmother's cousins. Scanned identity documents from the American Joint Distribution Committee and the British authorities, some handwritten, others typed out. They were full of mistakes. Imagine a Polish person trying to communicate with a British officer, which is why it was so difficult for me to locate them. There were even letters from other survivors who were trying to reach them years after the war. When I got back to the hotel, I sat down at the hotel lobby and showed those around me the documents that were given to me. Block IDs and dates. They became animated and explained to me what it all meant. That was across from my block. I stayed there as a baby, said another. No one remembered my relatives personally, but they were able to help me fill in all the missing details. They knew what the conditions were like, how the women must have felt being there. As I looked through the documents, knowing that my family in London were urgently trying to locate them, I found a telegram from one of Minna's relatives, anxious for news of welfare and whereabouts. Throughout my time here, I couldn't help but think of Richard Dimbleby, the BBC journalist who was first to report on the atrocities at Bergen-Belsen. How it was possible that their Uncle Harry heard this report knowing that his nieces were missing and wondering if they were still alive, and the relief he must have felt when he finally heard a response, and how he helped them build new lives in London. They had a safe route out, where many didn't.
Amy Leibowitz. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including The View from China on the ongoing trade war with Donald Trump. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, I'm Manishka Matanda-Doughty, the presenter of Diddy on Trial from BBC Sounds. Sean Diddy Combs is facing a fight for his freedom as his hugely anticipated trial starts for sex trafficking, racketeering with conspiracy, and transportation for prostitution. He denies all the charges. I'll be bringing you every twist and turn from the courtroom with the BBC's correspondents and our expert guests. So make sure you listen, subscribe now on BBC Sounds, and turn your push notifications on so you never miss a thing.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello, I'm Manishka Matanda-Doughty, the presenter of Diddy on Trial from BBC Sounds. Sean Diddy Combs is facing a fight for his freedom as his hugely anticipated trial starts for sex trafficking, racketeering with conspiracy, and transportation for prostitution. He denies all the charges. I'll be bringing you every twist and turn from the courtroom with the BBC's correspondents and our expert guests. So make sure you listen, subscribe now on BBC Sounds, and turn your push notifications on so you never miss a thing.
Hello. Today we're in Democratic Republic of Congo, where we visit a centre helping people impacted by relentless attacks from rebel groups to deal with their trauma. In Hungary, it's boom time for Chinese electric vehicle battery manufacturers as companies make inroads into the European market, but not everyone is happy. We attend a Yoruba festival in Nigeria, where, amid the vibrant festivities, we hear about a deeper push for an independent state. And finally, we're in Italy, where a centuries-old dialect is at risk of dying out. Our correspondent reflects on why it's still cherished by her community. But first to Los Angeles, where there's been a heavy crackdown after more than a week of protests over U.S. immigration raids. The protests started after federal agents searched the garment district in Los Angeles for workers suspected of being undocumented migrants. And in a sharp escalation, Donald Trump ordered the deployment of a total of 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines to help quell any unrest. California's Governor, Gavin Newsom, heavily criticized this rare deployment of the U.S. military without a request from state officials. describing it as a brazen abuse of power, adding that democracy is under assault. It's now being fought out in the courts. John Sudworth has been in Los Angeles.
It was a normal Friday in a very normal part of America, the parking lot of a hardware store in a Los Angeles suburb. What happened next, though, would help trigger days of sometimes violent protests and prompt deep and urgent questions about the limits of presidential power. Federal police officers in camouflage uniform and carrying assault rifles, dressed more for the battlefield than a branch of Home Depot, as it's pronounced here, in the Westlake area of the city, began detaining the labourers who often wait for casual cash-in-hand employment at the entrances to America's largest home improvement chain. The extraordinary show of force has since been repeated across more Home Depots and multiple other locations, all the kinds of businesses undocumented immigrants are known to work in, and the raids signalled to many that something significant was shifting in Donald Trump's signature policy. Repeated endlessly on the campaign trail and since his inauguration, the president has spoken of prioritising the removal of violent criminal immigrants, rapists and murderers, to use his words. But at one LA car wash raided over the weekend, the owner described to me how 6 of his workers had been detained. One of them, Jesus, had worked there for 18 years. He'd been in America for 30. He's now thought to be in a detention centre 800 miles away in Texas, leaving his wife Naomi and their 4 American-born children devastated. Her husband doesn't even have a parking ticket against his name, she told me. Their youngest son, just 5 years old, is simply unable to comprehend where his dad has gone. The prospect of them ever seeing him again on American soil seems bleak. But for those who have been listening carefully, what's just happened in LA shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. While the rhetoric about detaining the worst of the worst has made the headlines, Mr. Trump has also spoken frequently about enacting the largest mass deportation in history. It's a target that can only be met by shifting focus to the millions of hard-working yet undocumented long-term residents of this country. The reality for many of these workers is far more complex than the sweeping language often used to describe them. The president speaks of an invasion, yet their presence in such large numbers is the result of a system that has for decades largely turned a blind eye to their status, made it easy for employers to hire them with little risk, and has knowingly collected billions of dollars in tax and social security payments from them. Whole economic sectors, including California's agriculture industry, which provides a large share of America's fruit and vegetables, are dependent upon their labour. It is that reality that's prompted hundreds to rally in downtown LA this week under banners that read, "Protect our neighbours," or "Immigrants built California," to name just 2 of those that I saw people carrying. Mehmet, the owner of the car wash, is originally from Turkey and came to the US after winning the green card lottery 6 years ago. This is not the American dream, he tells me, standing by the closed sign now hanging at the entrance. Although largely peaceful, the protests have sometimes turned violent, but it's been contained. I've watched up close as the Los Angeles police have used force to prevent crowds from blocking roads, or moved in to arrest the small minority throwing stones and fireworks. And the demonstrations have been far more localised and smaller in scale than the TV pictures often suggest. In one street, with a dozen or so protesters waving flags, hemmed in by riot police and with the rubber bullets flying, I met one street entrepreneur nonchalantly pushing a trolley through the melee, selling ice-cold beer. Using terms like rebellion and insurrection, however, Mr. Trump has sent in 4,000 members of the National Guard and 700 Marines, the first time in 60 years that troops have been deployed onto the streets of a US city against the will of the state in question. While he claims a mandate for the broadening sweep of his immigration policy and the right to enforce it, California's Governor Gavin Newsom has described the deployment of soldiers as unnecessary and a deliberate attempt to provoke. What no one disputes, neither the president's supporters nor his opponents, is that if successful, the mass deportations will fundamentally change the nature of this country. 2 very different visions for the meaning of America how it sees itself and what it stands for, are being played out on the streets of LA. The political stakes, already high, have undoubtedly been raised by the addition of combat troops into the mix, and the protests have already begun spreading to other cities.
John Sudworth. Next, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an offensive of the M23 rebel group in January and February successfully occupied the cities of Goma and Bukavu. The Congolese army were defeated, and a large contingent of troops from South Africa, Tanzania and Malawi surrendered to the rebels. It has also established control over large coltan and gold mines in the region. Hugh Kinsella Cunningham was in South Kivu province, where he visited a mental health centre helping people deal with their trauma.
I was on the side of a hill overlooking the city of Bukavu, where thousands of little shacks perch along winding roads and steep valleys descend down to the still blue waters of Lake Kivu. Here, in Bagira Cemetery, the latest victims of Congo's conflict were being laid to rest. Along the side of a freshly dug grave, the setting sun turned the disturbed earth orange. Long shadows thrown by the silhouettes of exhausted diggers cast themselves over a row of 18 body bags deep in the pit. Days earlier, the city had been the scene of the latest attack of the M23 rebel group as they advanced along the lake. Drones buzzed overhead as the Congolese army retreated before them. I had rushed to the hospital to see surgeons working on a 14-year-old boy with a bullet lodged in his chest and wards full of injured civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. As the dust settled, the Red Cross began to collect the dead from the streets. To assure their victory and to celebrate their new control over North and South Kivu, the rebels hosted a parade for the defeated police and military units that had previously guarded the city. Flanked by his escort of stern young men wielding modern grenade launchers and crackling radios, M23 General Bernard Biamungu, who had previously commanded troops suspected of a massacre in 2022, spoke about the importance of building a new Congo, free from hate and corruption. The police, in mismatched uniforms and under armed guard, listened anxiously as they discovered they would be sent to camps to be retrained for membership into the rebel group. It wasn't the first time rebels have seized this city, or that commanders have spoken to captive audiences of their lofty aims of conquest, or that civilians have been killed or fled for their lives. For the past 30 years, since the Rwandan genocide, when Hutu militias sought refuge in the Kivus, evidence shows Rwanda's army has been supporting rebel groups in eastern Congo, something Rwanda's president no longer denies. While generations of rebellion have passed, and the acronyms of the militant groups change, the grievances and damages do not. An hour's drive into the South Kivu countryside, where the tracks are lined by boys herding sheep, is the Mutima Clinic. Here, civilians troubled by decades of atrocity can seek psychological help, a rarity in Congo. The massacres are repeated, the armed groups are all the same, and even our national army from Kinshasa loots and kills, explains Theodore Kalla, one of Mutima's psychotherapists, from his office in a former Belgian scientific research station. Outside his window, colourfully dressed women calmly pick through their rows of crops in the sun on this burning hot, windless day. The chaos and killing creates symptoms of extreme stress, says Theodore. Stress disorder impacts every part of a patient's life. They are too scared to go out to work in their fields. Their immune system weakens and they have no will to live. Despite recent fighting, some of his local patients have still come for their weekly appointment, and Theodore introduces me. Masirika says she heard gunfire for the first time when she was just 21. In that war, FDLR rebels raided her house, kidnapping her children. They were never seen again. She says that for 2 years afterwards, her hands constantly trembled. We can only hope that there will be no more fighting, she says. But here, we live in a state of uncertainty. This year, as M23 were on their march to Bukavu and were nearing her house, it triggered terrible memories and her hands began to shake again. So many have stories like this. 3 psychotherapists, including Theodore, are on standby at the clinic, and group therapy sessions are held every week. We could see the demand, explains Theodore. Patients were coming from all over the province, even making the journey from as far away as Uvira, another lakeside town 120 kilometers away. With M23 now victorious in much of the province, many displaced civilians are returning to their villages and finding their houses destroyed. Some damage is visible. But it is also the unseen burdens and scars of this unending conflict which have plagued many communities in Congo and are now traumatizing a new generation.
Hugh Kinsella Cunningham. Next to Hungary, which is set to become the biggest EV battery producer in Europe. In the country's east, a vast stretch of former farmland has been used for the construction of a mega lithium-ion battery plant. A Chinese company is behind the project, part of a growing trend of Chinese automakers ploughing money into building factories in Hungary to gain a foothold in the European market. European car makers are looking on nervously, and the EU last year increased tariffs to as much as 43.5% on Chinese EV imports. Meanwhile, Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, has described China's investment as an indispensable engine for Hungary's economic growth. Ellie House went to find out more.
The Mercedes car dealership in downtown Budapest still feels a bit Soviet. A long, block-like showroom with a low ceiling and stark white decor. It's no surprise, really. This used to be a parking garage for the Communist Party during the Cold War. But now it's a showcase for modern capitalism, filled with glossy cars standing to attention for potential buyers. Andras Jabo, the sales director, points to a large midnight blue SUV that nearly fills one of the showrooms. This is the very first electric vehicle produced in Hungary, he says proudly. It's getting more and more popular. That's something Hungary is banking on. It's quickly become one of the world's major production hubs for international firms making electric car batteries. A huge market, estimated to reach $9 trillion worldwide by 2030. And where other countries have been slow off the mark, Hungary appears to be racing along towards a new green gold rush. This boom is most evident in Debrecen, Hungary's second city. Here you can feel the buzz of rapid development. A 20-minute drive south of the historic town centre, with its famous yellow Calvinist church, is an industrial park, a great sweep of flat land occupied by one huge grey factory after another, like giant Lego blocks. 5 years ago, this was empty, and the footprint is growing. Dominating this new manufacturing village is a colossal construction site, 221 acres. A combination of heavy rain and the passage of countless diggers has churned up the ground so that it's impossible to avoid the spray of wet mud. Workers on their break hang around, dipping in and out of the shipping containers scattered next to the car park. One has a red and gold banner draped across its entrance, with Mandarin characters across the front. That's because this mammoth factory is to be the new European home of Chinese battery manufacturer CATL. It's the global market leader in battery production, and its investment is a boon for the Hungarian government. Here in Debrecen, CATL gets access to a skilled workforce, raw materials, and, perhaps most importantly, a pathway to European markets. The European Union has recently imposed tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, but this doesn't include EVs made in Europe using parts from Chinese companies. We don't believe in this protectionism, Hungary's economy minister Marton Nagy tells me, shaking his head. He sits on the other side of an imposing desk, framed by screens with live graphs charting the state of the economy. You know, a lot of countries fear the Chinese investors because technologically they're more advanced and they have cheaper products, he says. The EU has said Chinese manufacturers unfairly benefit from government subsidies, undercutting European prices. But there's another reason why some in Europe are wary of cheap Chinese electric cars flooding the market: defence. Mate Galli, a university student who has been protesting against the construction of the factory, says, "I believe it's very dangerous." People like Mate are concerned that a reliance on Chinese technology in our supply chains might threaten Europe's ability to respond should international tensions flare up, for example, over Taiwan. He tells me he fears the entire world will become dependent on China. What about the jobs and investment that a manufacturing boom brings? Mate says that local people worry that their community won't see these benefits because the companies will import foreign workers, mostly from Asia. Minister Nagy was quick to assure us that employers must prove that they can't find homegrown Hungarian labour before they can hire what the government likes to call guest workers. We travel south to the town of Poksh amid delicate falling snow. A massive grey building site disturbs the flat fields. In the distance, you can see the red and white stripes of two chimneys, which belong to Hungary's only operational nuclear power plant. The production of EV batteries requires a lot of electricity, far more than Hungary's current grid can sustain. So the government is building 2 new nuclear reactors, and the company leading the construction? Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear energy company. The sun finally comes out, providing glorious respite from the biting cold as we trace the Danube River back to the capital. The water slices the city into Buda and Pest, west and east. As I watch it flow, I think about whether it's possible to prioritise action on climate change, defence, national and economic interests all at the same time. Those are the trade-offs that we are all facing.
Ellie House.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next, we're in Nigeria's southwest, where every year a small town in Ogun State transforms into a vibrant cultural stage for a festival which celebrates the cultural identity of the Yoruba people and communal pride. It's viewed as an act of homage, a living record of history, and a reminder of how Nigeria's diverse cultures can exist in harmony. Nkechi Ogbonna went to watch the festivities.
Shots are fired into the air from locally made rifles. White smoke is released from gunpowder. Thousands scream in excitement as colourful horsemen and women ride gallantly into the arena. It signals the arrival of the Baloguns and Eleshins, the warriors of the ancient Ijebu kingdom. They begin parading round the arena, paying their respects to the king. The fattened black, brown, and white stallions are adorned with gold and silver ornaments and bright blue, red, and yellow saddles. This is one of the high points of the Ojude Oba festival of the Ijebu people, a subgroup of the Yoruba ethnic group in Nigeria's southwest Ogun State. The yearly festival sees thousands of locals and members of the diaspora return home to pay homage to the Awujale, the king of Ijebuland. On our way into the arena in Ijebu-Ode, I see women tying their head wraps by the roadside, makeup artists carefully tending to customers' faces, sitting on small stools with mirrors in their hands. Ojude Oba, a Yoruba word meaning the king's forecourt, was initially a Muslim activity set on the third day of Eid al-Adha, when the worshippers paid homage to the traditionalist king for allowing them to practice their religion freely. This over 2-century-old practice has now morphed into a flamboyant display of culture, transcending religious beliefs. Thousands of men and women are organized into subgroups of about 100 people each. Each group, known as Regbe-Regbes or age groups, are dressed in matching outfits. They begin to parade around the stadium, dancing to the rhythm of thunderous talking drums, traditional Yoruba hourglass-shaped instruments that imitate human speech to convey messages and music. The women wear iro and buba, a big blouse with a long skirt tied around the waist, often made from lace or ashoke, a traditionally woven fabric with a matching head wrap which is called gele. Performers are dripping in sweat in the 39-degree heat. The heat provides another opportunity for a fashion item. The Regbe-Regbes are using colorful feathered fans with their names and traditional titles boldly crested on it to cool off. They are also wearing designer diamante-encrusted sunglasses. One woman in a yellow, white, and blue Iran buba with matching handbag, gele, and handheld fan tells me she woke up at 4 a.m., met her makeup artist an hour later, and spent 2 more hours getting dressed. Their male counterparts are dressed like royalty, wearing colorful yards of fabric layered on top of a long blouse and trousers known as agbada. They wear matching caps known as fila. A Nigerian woman living in the UK says she is happy to return home once a year to celebrate the festival, visit family, and rekindle old friendships. She's wearing red and blue ashoke and proudly tells me her outfit is an opportunity to showcase her Yoruba culture. Beyond the cultural display, the Ojudoba Festival also uses the Ijebu age group system to embark on community development projects to improve the lives of the locals. These include projects in healthcare, sanitation, water, and education. Posing majestically for the cameras with his walking stick, shades, and a cigar, one man tells me the best thing about the festival is that it is inclusive, transcending financial divides. A bank executive and a gateman could be sitting together within their age group, he says. A very uncommon sight in Nigeria where a huge divide exists between social classes. There was a political edge to this event. One sentiment echoed around this festival is the demand for the creation of Ijebu State, in addition to Nigeria's existing 36 states. Some age groups marching with redrawn flags of the proposed communities say Ijebu is the only province that wasn't converted into a state and deserves autonomy. An earlier encounter with a man dressed in gold agbada from one regbe encapsulated the meaning of the day for me. I feel ecstatic about the festival. What my father did, our forefathers did, we are doing, and we are passing it to the next generation, he said.
Nkechi Ogbonna. And finally, we're in Italy. According to UNESCO, there are more than 30 dialects and minority languages spoken across the country. But it's estimated that 90% of the population using these languages is over 70, so this cultural heritage will soon die out. Italian-born journalist Alice Gioia reflects on what this loss means to her.
The first time I saw my unborn baby girl, she was just a tiny, wriggly creature, not more than a few centimeters long, her heart pulsating in black and white on the ultrasound monitor. As I was staring at her, a word came to me, passarei, which means little sparrow in my native dialect. It's a term of endearment I haven't used or heard in years. It's what my nonno Luigi, my late granddad, used to call me when I was a child. I come from a small northern Italian town called Pavia, known for its medieval towers, its rice paddies, and its thick winter fog. Most people there speak 2 languages, modern Italian, with a strong northern accent, and dialetto pavese, a vulgarized form of Latin that bears witness to centuries of history. Pavia, about 30 miles south of Milan, has always been a land of conquests. Romans, French, Austrians, and Spaniards passed through here. It was at one point the capital of the kingdom of the Longobards, a Germanic tribe that ruled over most of the Italian peninsula in the 6th century. That's why, in my local dialect, foreign sounds meet Latin words. Apple, or mela in Italian, is pum in dialetto, which is very similar to the French pomme. Chair, or sedia in Italian, is cadrega from the Latin cathedra. Pavia is surrounded by vast farmlands, made fertile by the frequent floodings of the Po River. Again, dialect is a reflection of that. Its colourful expressions are often borrowed from farming life. If you want to tell someone to get lost, you tell them, "Vacia pairat," go catch the rats. In cafes and shops in Pavia, older patrons still mix up Italian and dialetto pavese. A Chinese bartender, who moved here a few years ago, told me she can speak a few words in dialect, enough to get by and to maintain a rapport with her customers. The expression she uses the most, though, is, "Ho capito," sorry, I didn't understand. Although it's not recognised as an official language, Dialetto pavese has its own very complicated grammar, codified in several dictionaries. It's not taught in schools, but people learn in other ways. I grew up surrounded by people who spoke dialect. My grandparents, who were factory workers and sharecroppers, and my uncle Lelo, who used to send me a weekly text message with a new expression for me to learn. My favourite one was "Faba la lej," literally, make your eye dance around, which means be careful, pay attention, notice the details. When he passed away, I had nobody to practice my dialect with. People in Pavia always make fun of me when I try to speak dialect. But the thing is, my generation was encouraged to speak proper Italian, to move away from expressions that sound rough and unpolished. And yet, I owe so much to this peasant language. In a way, I've always been bilingual, always switching between the highbrow Italian spoken at school and the dialect spoken at home. And that's why I think I find learning other languages quite easy. But I have very little hope that my local dialect, Dialetto pavese, will survive. A fear shared by dialect expert Andrea Borghi. He says that paradoxically, you could still use our shared dialect to communicate with an ancient Longobard who lived in 600 AD, but you'd struggle to make yourself understood by today's teenagers. They are more drawn towards English and use dialect words only when they're talking about football, usually without even knowing the real meaning of certain expressions. For example, when a footballer misses a penalty kick, they say, "He's a kanda paye." Again, borrowing a farming image. A dog that's not good enough to be kept in the house and is forced to sleep in a barn. I have a feeling that the vast majority of teenagers who use that expression today have never even stepped into a barn. Languages are always evolving, but this one, which travelled through centuries and is anchored to a way of life that's long gone, will slowly fade into darkness. Will I teach my daughter, who will already have to grow up with English and Italian intertwined in the fabric of her everyday life, my native dialect as well? I doubt it, but I will be sure to call her Passarei, Little Sparrow, from time to time.
Felice Gioia. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch on what life is like under Russian occupation in Crimea. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, I'm Manishka Matanda-Doughty, the presenter of Diddy on Trial from BBC Sounds. Sean Diddy Combs is facing a fight for his freedom as his hugely anticipated trial starts for sex trafficking, racketeering with conspiracy, and transportation for prostitution. He denies all the charges. I'll be bringing you every twist and turn from the courtroom with the BBC's correspondents and our expert guests. So make sure you listen, subscribe now on BBC Sounds, and turn your push notifications on so you never miss a thing.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today, President Putin talks military boots on the ground at his international gathering in St. Petersburg. We're in the US, where Donald Trump's MAGA loyalists were incensed by his decision to attack Iran, but quick to forgive. And we hear how Paraguay is staking a claim on Argentina's national drink, the earthy brew of mate, which counts Lionel Messi among its fans. And finally, in Transylvania, we explore the ebb and flow of a centuries-old Saxon settlement nestled amid an ancient forest. But first, in a week which began with the news that the US had gone ahead with airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, fears of an accelerating regional conflict have, for the time being, been tempered. Israel's attacks on Iran, which killed hundreds of civilians, according to the UN, led thousands of people to flee cities under fire. Iranian attacks have killed 28 people in Israel, according to the authorities there. Ola Guerin has been on Turkey's border with Iran, where she spoke to Iranians who were escaping the war and others going back home.
What would you grab if your country was being bombed and you were fleeing your home? One Iranian mother and her teenage daughter crossed the border with just a few small bags and a birdcage housing their beloved parakeet. They had run from the city of Karaja near Tehran. Like many we met, they didn't want to be named. Leaving Iran does not mean shedding the fear of the regime, which was carrying on with repression as usual, right up to the bombing. Just 1 or 2 days before the war started, I got an SMS, the mother told us angrily. It said, "This is an Islamic country, you need to cover your hair." She assumed she had been spotted, bareheaded, by a traffic camera in the street. Now she and her daughter were safe from Iranian oppression and Israeli missiles, but with no place to go. "We hope to get to Europe," she said, her voice trailing off. "We don't know if any country will be good to us or take us in." They had just come through Turkey's Kapikoy border crossing under a baking sun. As Israel and then America pounded Iran, the crossing, flanked by rugged hills, had become a hub of relief and uncertainty. But even as mother and daughter were fleeing the world's newest war, others were going back home, though a ceasefire was yet to come. Some told us they were returning after holidays or work trips. Others said they were rushing back because they feared for their loved ones. Many were unwilling to be interviewed. "We're too afraid," one man said, as he headed into Iran. A government employee returning to Tehran with his family agreed to speak without being identified. "Would the regime fall?" I asked. "Yes, I think so," he said. "In the end, but not yet." And if that happens, he fears the military might take over. Among the cluster of arrivals on the Turkish side of the border, some wheeling designer luggage, others shouldering backpacks, there were conflicting views about the fate of the authorities. "They've been clinging on for decades," said a tall young man dressed head to toe in black, with a bitter shake of his head. "They can probably hang on a lot longer." He had been planning his exit for a year and already had a visa for Canada. An Iranian businessman called Ali told us the bombing had benefited the authorities in the short term. "My neighbours, my friends, my family, they were all very critical of the government," he said. "Now the frustrations have somehow been forgotten. They're supporting the government because it's under foreign attack. It's very different from before the war." Another factor now unifies Iranians, according to Ali. Everyone says they hate Mr. Orange, he said, referring to President Trump. Ali's apartment is opposite Iranian state TV, which was hit by an Israeli airstrike. I counted 4 missiles myself, he said. My place was shaking as if it was an earthquake. My city, Tehran, which I have always loved, now looks like a war zone. As for Iran's nuclear program, at the heart of that war, he said it destroyed 2 decades of our lives. Many we spoke to condemned Israel's killing of civilians in Iran. Hundreds have been killed, according to the United Nations. But some, like Dariush, who's 13, hoped that Israeli missiles would dislodge the regime. He came bounding onto Turkish soil, followed by his younger brother and his mother. When we asked to speak to her, she said, "You can talk to Dariush instead." The teenager was articulate and outspoken. We could hear the bombs and the missiles, he said. Thick black smoke was rising in front of our house. I wasn't scared at all. I was very happy about this, because I felt that finally my freedom was near. Then he punched the air and chanted, "Woman, life, freedom," the name of an Iranian protest movement brutally crushed in recent years. Dariush told us he would return home only when the Islamic Republic was gone. For now, there is a ceasefire, and despite the destruction and humiliation imposed on the regime, so far at least, it is holding on.
Ola Guerin. Next, as Western leaders gathered recently for the G7 and NATO summits, Russia's President Vladimir Putin held his own annual international gathering. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is seen as an opportunity to entice foreign investment into the country, though Western investors have largely stayed away in recent years. And while this was an economic summit in name, Steve Rosenberg found the focus this year to be much more geared towards defense and the promotion of Russia's military might.
Imagine you're a president who is trying to attract foreign investment and boost your country's economy. Imagine, to help you do this, you've organised a big international economic forum, attended by people from, so you claim, 140 countries and territories. There you are, the host, up on stage. What would you say? What killer line would you deliver that would be guaranteed to make a positive impression on your audience? One phrase, one comment that everyone would be talking about as they leave the hall. At his economic forum in St. Petersburg, President Putin came out with this line: "Where the foot of a Russian soldier steps, that's ours." That's what all the newspapers here, all the commentators in Russia have been talking about ever since. This is the Putin quote they've been repeating. The tabloid Moskovsky Komsomolets called it phrase of the day, phrase of the week, the most important phrase of recent years. With it, the newspaper said, Vladimir Putin succinctly and precisely summed up his current political credo and his long-term political strategy, the strategy of the foot of the Russian soldier. This phrase has nothing, of course, to do with the economy, and everything to do with military ambition. And that is the point. Ever since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the goal of economic prosperity has come a distant second to the Kremlin's main objective, defeating Ukraine. And the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum did little to hide that. True, there were lots of shiny, sparkling display stands and company presentations, futuristic robots and AI galore. But on arrival at the exhibition centre, the very first thing you saw on display outside was the latest range of Russian military vehicles. Inside, the Ukrainian regions that Russia has seized, occupied, and claims to have annexed had been given their own display stands and were flying Russian flags. Mind you, at this forum, it wasn't only the war in Ukraine that hung in the air. War in the Middle East was very much on people's minds, and that was before Donald Trump gave the orders for airstrikes at the weekend. As I was queuing up to enter the main hall, ahead of Vladimir Putin's keynote speech, a Russian MP came up to me. "Tell me," he said, "are you going to drop a bomb?" "What bomb?" I asked. "A bomb on Iran," he replied. "I'm not planning to bomb anyone," I insisted. "Do you mean, is Donald Trump going to?" "Ah, Trump does whatever you tell him to do," the MP retorted. "The British are the ones pressing his buttons. You and the deep state." He smiled. But Russia's government isn't smiling. The prospect of regime change in Iran worries Moscow. In the last 6 months, the Kremlin has already lost one key ally in the Middle East, President Assad, deposed in Syria. President Putin will not want to lose another, especially since a few months back he signed a so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement with Iran. Crucially, though, the Iran-Russia deal is not a military alliance. It does not oblige Moscow to come to Tehran's defence in the event of war. So, when Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin this week, there were words of support, plenty, from President Putin, but he seemed in no rush to provide Tehran with military assistance. After all, Russia is consumed by its own war against Ukraine. But aside from that, the Kremlin is keen to maintain strong ties with Israel too. We have good relations with the Israeli government. Russian MP and TV host Yevgeny Popov told me at the Economic Forum. He explained why. Israel did not impose sanctions on us, and it did not supply Ukraine with weapons. In other words, in the Middle East, Russia is engaged in a balancing act. When he makes speeches or TV appearances, President Putin tries to look and sound supremely confident. But I can't help feeling that at this year's St. Petersburg Forum, the overriding atmosphere was one of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the Russian economy. Even government officials were openly admitting there are signs of a recession. Uncertainty regarding Russia's war in Ukraine, now in its 4th year. Uncertainty about the situation in the Middle East. Not that uncertainty is a Russian monopoly. As Russian journalist and socialite Ksenia Sobchak pointed out when we chatted in St. Petersburg. "Maybe 3 years ago, when everything began," said Ksenia, referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, "maybe then we in Russia could say, where is our future? But 3 years on, we see that all the world is on fire. Israel, Iran, Pakistan, India. Today, we all lack a good picture of the future."
Steve Rosenberg. Donald Trump's sudden decision to attack Iran's nuclear sites was met with concern by many in Washington, including some of his most ardent supporters. The Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, a longtime Trump loyalist, decried it as a complete bait-and-switch, aimed to please military-minded neocons with ties to the defense industry. But just how long did this disappointment last? Bernd de Busman has been gauging the mood among Republicans in and around the White House.
I was standing on a rooftop in the sweltering, humid heat of Washington, D.C., admiring the skyline near the National Cathedral, when phones across the roof began ringing and buzzing nearly in unison, including my own. To my right and left, journalists, diplomats, and government staffers were glancing down at their phones, gasping audibly and eyes widening before a sudden mad dash to Ubers and cars. It had happened. After days of mixed signals from Donald Trump, the U.S. had struck Iran's nuclear facilities. The airstrikes on facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan capped off 2 weeks of twists and turns which, even by the standards of Trump's White House, were chaotic and uncertain. Just 10 days earlier, I covered what seemed to be a relatively tame congressional picnic at the White House. As lawmakers gathered on the South Lawn, the president signaled that he would like to give diplomatic talks with Tehran another chance. Hours later, Israel began striking Iranian military sites. That evening began a series of confusing days and nights in which President Trump kept the world guessing as to his true intentions. The final decision ultimately came on Saturday while flying on Marine One, the presidential helicopter, over his opulent estate in New Jersey via a phone call to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. For Mr. Trump, the decision was a politically tricky one. He had, after all, campaigned heavily on avoiding messy foreign entanglements, or, in his words, the stupid endless wars like those which had brought thousands of young Americans home in flag-draped coffins from Iraq and Afghanistan.
It was a message that found a receptive audience in the isolationist wing of his supporters. And after news of the strikes broke, several high-profile loyalists were quick to criticize the president. Capitol Hill ally Marjorie Taylor Greene lambasted the financial cost of foreign wars at a time when the U.S. debt is hovering around $37 trillion. The former Fox News host, Tucker Carlson, also invoked the specter of the Iraq War. But for all their initial clamor, it was noticeable how quickly most fell in line behind the president, praising him for a quick and clean strike that did not lead to further conflict. Donald Trump later said that Tucker Carlson had called to apologize, and he posted a quick "thank God" after the bombs were dropped. Trump's former strategist, Steve Bannon, for his part, praised the president for what he termed a one-and-done raid that avoided the ugly possibility of managing regime change in Tehran on Israel's behalf. A leading voice in the MAGA movement, Jack Posobiec, had told his many followers that an Iran strike would disastrously split the pro-Trump movement, but ended up seemingly praising the president for ending Iran's nuclear ambitions as had been promised from day one. Another Trump hardliner who had voiced her opposition to any further U.S. involvement in the Middle East later told me, apologetically, that she should have trusted in the president's plan, or 4D chess, as she called it. That shift came as no surprise to me. My experience covering rally after rally of the 2024 election left me convinced that in U.S. politics, there is no one that can inspire the same sort of devotion among supporters as Donald Trump. On the other end of the debate were the Iran hawks in the Republican establishment, who had long been eager for the U.S. or Israel to eliminate any possibility that Iran could build a functioning nuclear weapon or forever upset the balance of power in the Middle East. Just days before the attack, Mr. Trump had set a 2-week deadline to give talks a chance, which many in Washington, myself included, took as a sign that he was trying to lower the temperature. Maybe, just maybe, he would sit this war out. His words were later described as a head fake by officials, a sporting ruse that many within his own administration were unaware of. But the die was already cast after midnight on Friday when 1,000 miles away from Washington, at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, 7 futuristic-looking B-2 Spirit bombers took off and headed east, each armed with a pair of massive bunker-busting bombs. The saga has left many in Washington with a lesson that, even for those working closest to him, it is impossible to predict what Donald Trump, perhaps the most unpredictable president in U.S. history, will do.
Ben de Busman.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Have you ever heard of the traditional South American drink mate? For the uninitiated, it's a caffeine-rich herbal brew made by infusing dried yerba mate leaves in hot water, and it has very specific rules regarding how it should be served. Argentina is its biggest producer, and arguably the country most closely associated with the drink. But on a recent visit to its smaller landlocked neighbour Paraguay, Jane Chambers found locals to be just as passionate about mate culture, and somewhat miffed by its affiliation with their bigger neighbour.
We're driving through a fiery red and pink sunrise, with mist shrouding the fields and lush green volcanoes rearing up in the distance. I'm in a car full of Paraguayans, and Erica's busy trying to pour boiling water from a flask into a gourd full of dried mate leaves. She manages it without giving herself third-degree burns, which is a relief, given I'm sitting next to her. She passes the brew around the car, and the passengers start taking appreciative sips out of the traditional metal straw, known as a bombilla. Yerba mate comes from a shrub that can grow into a 15 meters tall tree. The Guarani people, who live across South America, foraged for its leaves hundreds of years ago. For them it was a sacred drink with energizing health benefits that reduced hunger pangs. These days it's grown in plantations by indigenous communities and small-scale farmers. Drinking it's a communal experience which shows friendship and respect for others. Erica offers me a sip. I politely refuse. I have to confess, the few times I've tried mate, the taste conjures up old, dry grass like lawn mowings. But I'm a Philistine. Those in the know compare it to a strong green tea, which can be bitter or sweet, depending on how much sugar you add. The taste for it stretches across this region, and it's recently been going global thanks to viral videos. Football legend Lionel Messi is a huge fan, and recently showed off his $1,000 mate brewing setup on TikTok. But Paraguay bristles a little about its national drink being so prominently linked to another country. I don't know why everyone thinks of Argentina when they hear the word mate, Erica says wistfully. I suppose it's because they're so much bigger and more powerful, but it's part of our daily life. I started drinking it when I was a baby. Just like the other mate-drinking countries of Argentina, Uruguay and Brazil, Paraguayans take its preparation seriously. Traditional gourds are made from dried squash or calabash, the fruit of a tropical tree. Once dry, they become hard like wood and need to be cured before use by soaking them in water so they don't crack. There's an elaborate etiquette to drinking it and a long list of no-nos. Do not grab, move, swirl or play with the bombilla straw. This can potentially ruin the taste of the mate. And do not take too long to drink it because the rest of the group may grow impatient, and so on. We dedicate the first sip to its patron saint, Santo Tomás, Erica explains. If you don't, it's bad luck. But a hot sip of mate is not the only option. We like to start with mate, which is a hot drink, but as the day warms up, we move on to tereré, which we drink with cold water and lots of ice, Julia explains. Temperatures frequently climb to over 35 degrees here. This cooling drink made with yerba mate, as well as other medicinal herbs, is an adaptation unique to Paraguay. Tereré is the Guarani ancestral drink of Paraguay and known as Paraguayan green gold. Jesuit priests in the 16th century remarked on how popular it was with the locals. The Spanish conquistadores, often keen to suppress local cultural quirks, even tried to ban people from drinking it, calling it a vice which induced laziness. But no one paid them any notice, and in the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries started the mass cultivation of yerba mate, grown by indigenous communities. For 300 years it was a vital part of the country's economy, even used as currency when metal coins weren't available. Julia tells me she likes to visit the local market where Guarani women sell medicinal herbs like boldo, lemongrass or peppermint to mush up in a mortar to add to the tereré. They know what herbs work for a stomachache and other things, even if you've just split up with your boyfriend, had a fight with your mother, or need luck to pass an exam, she explains. She says that mate and tereré drinkers are part of a larger brotherhood of Guarani-speaking people who used to live in the lush regions of what's now Paraguay, Brazil, and parts of Argentina. So really, mate is a drink that goes beyond borders. But Julia's not giving up on her own country's claim. She flashes me a triumphant smile. Did you know that the scientific name for yerba mate is Ilex paraguayensis, she asks. See, it even has our name.
Jane Chambers. And finally, we're in Transylvania, where, nestled between the forests, a community of Saxons once settled and thrived for 8 centuries. Initially invited there by the Hungarian king in the Middle Ages, some emigrated when the land came under Romanian control after the First World War, and then in more significant numbers decades later under former dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. Sarah Wheeler visited a village where Saxons once made their home.
In the empty organ loft of a church on the Transylvanian plateau, a red-backed shrike flapped its wings. Below beechwood panels carved with love in the 14th century, a banner embroidered with a Gothic German script urged congregants to work hard and love God. Even the digits slotted into the board displaying hymn numbers were printed in an extravagantly antique font. The pews had gone, like the organ, and so had the Saxon worshippers. The Transylvanian plateau, at once singularly lush and austere, nestles into the horseshoe of the wooded Carpathian Mountains. The name itself means the land between the forests. 8 centuries ago, when Hungary controlled the south of the region, King Geza II invited groups of Saxon craftsmen, merchants and farmers to come and settle. They would contribute to economic growth and help defend the borders of Hungarian lands. Migrants duly arrived from the Rhineland and the Low Countries, bringing their skills, and they prospered and formed guilds and stored their grain under the eaves of the blunt-nosed gables of their homes, and they built churches on the Green Plateau. The village of Kopshamare lies at the head of 3 valleys, all close to the trading passes. Its Saxon founders continued speaking a Luxembourgish German as the generations unfurled, and they fortified their church against waves of invaders as well as a hostile Ottoman Empire. In the 16th century they put up a thick defensive wall and a double-level north tower, both of which still stand together in a unique military and ecclesiastic fusion. The shrike had flown out of a glassless window, and I followed, through the door, where carved pictograms of the guildsmen's axes and forges butted up against faded frescoes of the same saints which stare out of icons in the Orthodox church at the other end of the main street. Outside, villagers had stacked silvered logs neatly against the flying buttresses. By the end of the Second World War, the Saxons had lost their merchant class status, even before the communist regime destroyed their economic base. More than 500,000 had emigrated to ancestral homelands prior to the Romanian Revolution in 1989, and when a reunifying Germany offered citizenship to the Romanian Saxons, many more followed. They had lasted 8 centuries in their land between the forests, and were gone in 8 decades. "Are there any Saxons left in the village?" I asked my friend Cosmin, a native of Kopshamare who lives now in Brasov, the big city a couple of hours away, known to the Saxons as Kronstadt. "No," he replied. "There is one man in the next village. He married a Romanian." Had he, Cosmin, known any Saxons as a child? "No," he said again, "but my grandparents spoke of their Saxon neighbours. They said they gave them cream from their cow when the children were sick." Along the main street beyond the church, red-tiled roofs and the distinctive gables revealed the enduring Saxon legacy. The land around was lapped and layered, like Transylvanian history. Alfalfa, potatoes and corn grew among overgrown outlines of terraced vineyards. Phylloxera had long ago blighted the vines. Clouds of red-banded fritillaries, a butterfly which thrives in abandoned vineyards, drifted between the struts of the buttresses and the stands of purple irises flourishing in the church garden. Cosmin and I sat on a pile of logs. The region had moved away from Saxon thinking, he said. In the presidential election in May, most people in Kopshamare had voted for Georgi Simeon, leader of the Anti-Migrant Alliance for the Union of Romanians. "We all thought," Cosmin said, "he's a strong man, he will look after us." But Simeon lost, not without controversy, despite his party's heavy use of TikTok, a platform with deep penetration in Romania. So perhaps another kind of Saxon legacy lingered too. Work hard, heads high, be hospitable. We got up to return to the bus stop, passing a meadow of Siberian bellflowers. On our way, I realised that of course there were still Saxons in Kopshamare. They were in the cemetery behind the church. Generations of Johannas, Wilhelms and Reginas, their mottled headstones oblique among waist-deep grasses below the spreading hornbeams.
Sarah Wheeler, and that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, it's Lucy Worsley here, and we're back with a brand new series of Lady Swindlers.
Here we are in cell number 1. I'm just shutting us in, Ross.
Wow. Following in the footsteps of some all-new criminals.
Can you take me down to the other end of Baker Street, please?
Certainly, jump in.
Thank you.
Join me and my all-female team of detectives as we revisit the audacious crimes of women trying to make it in a world made for men.
This is a story of working class women trying to get by. This is survival.
Lady Swindlers Season 2 with Lucy Worsley from BBC Radio 4. Listen now on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.